Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming to day 2 of our talks at Planted. Planted is the first design exhibition that seeks to connect people, spaces, and nature to create happier, healthier, greener, and more regenerative spaces for us all to live in. In the 4th of our talks today, we'll be investigating the role that food has and our relationship with it in Can Food Save the World? So in the talk, we're going to be looking at how we reconnect people with the food that they eat every day and the role that the natural and the built environment has to play in it. And with ever-increasing pressure on our land to mitigate climate change, supply energy, and to supply nutrition for a global population, our food systems are under increasing stress and not necessarily going in the right direction. So food is obviously central to all life, but there is a really complex set of issues around the food systems that we've created. Resulting from that is a health crisis, a loss of biodiversity, soil depletion, industrialised farming techniques, and issues around urban planning. There are all sorts of really complicated things that we need to deal with, and the food systems that we have can resolve many of them. So today we have a really fantastic, really varied panel to discuss and unravel these issues and offer us insights as to how we can start to fix them. So today on our panel we've got Mark Shayla from This Is Abe and Green Lab. We've got Sarah Fernan from the very local food hub in Brighton, and Stuart Dodd, CEO of River Cottage and former architect. So the format of the talk is that each of our speakers will introduce themselves for about 5 to 7 minutes and tell you a little bit more about their background, their relationship with these food systems. And then we're going to have a series of questions. Sadly, we are not going to be able to pass a roving microphone round for questions, but I think what you're going to learn today is just going to open your eyes to our toxic food systems and how we can start to resolve some of these issues. So to kick us off this morning, I'd like to introduce the unbelievably inspiring, charismatic Mark Shayla to tell us a little bit more about your life and your relationship with food and the systems that we're living with.
Oh, you. Thank you. Thank you very much. My name's Mark, and I work, I can split this intro into 2. The things that I do for work, which are important, and the things that I do that aren't work. And the things that I do for work, so I'm an environmental consultant. I'm a founding partner of something called Green Labs, which was in Bermondsey. It's now moving to Spain. It's quite a big shift up in the world, actually, but I didn't get the move with it, sadly. And I'm also part of something called Save Our Soils, which is a kind of regenerative. I know the word regenerative is loaded, and we can discuss that in a minute. A regenerative agriculture project based up in North Yorkshire. And I've worked with food companies ranging from the very big and not very cuddly, so people like Coca-Cola, Unilever, Heinz, all full of amazing people, but not always aligned with where we probably should be going, right? To really small companies like All Plants, Proper Corn, and trying to kind of bring small players to the world as well. And then at Green Lab, we do things like we incubate, or we provide spaces for very small startups, whether that be microgreen startups or whether that be insect protein into fish food startups. Our entire basement was full of black soldier fly and trout for about 4 years. I didn't go down there. It really smelled horribly badly. In a previous life, I was head of sustainability for Asda, just as Walmart bought Asda at the time when they decided that we should probably put some guns in our sportswear section until we explained the law to them. And then they went, we won't be doing that then. And I did a lot of work on food waste and sewage sludge, co-digestion of kind of closing the loop at the back end. If I'm honest, I wasn't strong enough. I couldn't be doing with it, and I left after about 11 months. But I learned I learned loads actually, Oliver. It's a really interesting insight into that world. And now I'm a gun for hire essentially. In my part-time stuff, the stuff I've done in the spare time, I helped and start a load of stuff in Bradford back 30 years ago nearly, in permaculture, in community gardens, bringing the power of production into people's hands. And that was as much about, if I'm honest, that was as much about equity and access to good fruit and vegetables as it was about sustainability. And actually, I think food is political. And a good friend of mine at that time, Pam Walhurst, started Incredible Edible in neighbouring Halifax, and we're still in touch. She's amazing, firebrand. And so a lot of that work was kind of very community grounded. So I've got these two levels, corporate nasties and community goodies. Actually, they're much more interlaced than you could possibly imagine. Is that 5 minutes? Have I?
No, you've still got a minute left.
Still got a minute left. Okay. I'm a Virgo. I'm vegan, but I've still got gout, which I think is dreadfully unfair. I don't drink, and I'm still fun at parties. Okay.
And an ultra runner.
Well, I will be tomorrow. Yeah, I will be tomorrow. Yeah.
Quite a mix.
Yeah, I do mix it up.
Lovely. Sarah.
Hi there, thank you. Can you hear me all right? I think
a little bit
closer. I'm Sarah Fernan. It's really nice to be here and be welcomed, and I'm quite wowed by the people I'm accompanied by. So I run Very Local Food Hubs, the Very Local Food Hubs project in Brighton, in East Brighton, and that's a project that came out of the pandemic. Basically, I'm bringing the community side to this talk. Basically, I do a lot of grassroots community action work around food and around empowering people around food and that equity that you were just talking about, like thinking about kind of the inequalities between access to fresh food, education, actually being able to grow food yourselves, that kind of thing. So that's what I've been working on most recently. My background is in I started as an art teacher, and then I ended up being a forest school leader, and I run a community forest school. And I do that in partnership with Bevending Community Garden, and that's how I got involved in food. Basically, I was working with families and realising there was really high food poverty in the area that I'm working with, and that it's very taboo and people didn't want to talk about it, and that actually it was really important to put food on the agenda in those sessions. And people started to open up in the context of being outdoors and in nature. And that the nature connection that I was promoting was really kind of bound up in food. That was a really accessible way in to talk about what was on your plate and where it came from, and how it could make you feel good if you were able to share it and share those skills as well. So that's how I kind of came to food as a focus. But the Very Local Food Hubs project is a collaborative project with different local organisers, and it was about the pandemic, and the pandemic kind of extenuating the crisis that was already there. It just made things really much worse in terms of food access in my area. So we started to look at how to join things up, how to work with food banks, how to sort out some of the food waste issues that were going on, how to work with the gleaning networks. There were lots of different things that we were trying to pull together to give people access to fresh food at a time when they were facing all sorts of other challenges too, both emotional, mobility, all sorts of things. And because we're on the urban fringes, access was a really key issue, but also affordability. And it was quite noticeable that if you had a choice in terms of where you could get your food from, that was really dependent on your income or what your access to money was. And if there was nothing in Aldi, for example, and that was where you used to get your fruit and veg, then you didn't have the choice to go to Sainsbury's that was a bit further down the road, therefore you went without. And actually, we really wanted to do something about that. And so we ran a veg box project initially, and now we're doing food growing with the local community because we wanted to increase production in our area. And we're doing like cooking conversations as well, just trying to empower people about how to use veg and what they can do that's healthy and affordable.
Lovely, thank you. Lots of really inspiring, I guess, grassroots work.
Yes.
Yeah. And Stuart from the River Cottage.
Thanks, Oliver. So I started out as an architect, as Oliver says, not a former architect either. I'm still proud to say I am an architect, and as Oliver knows, we went to university together at the Bartlett School at
You've
University
still got the
College.
glasses to prove it, haven't you?
Thanks, Oliver. And you've got the suit. So 30 years ago, whilst I was a student at UCL, I met Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall, and he became one of my very close friends. And when I left university, he asked me to design his house, which was one of my first ever projects. And from that point on, he founded River. He was firstly on TV doing River Cottage TV shows, and then he founded River Cottage, which was a business about 20 years ago, and I became their architect, designing all their buildings over time. So from the early days, it was a fairly small-scale operation outside of Bridport in Dorset, where they had a small farm which they rented. We've moved forward to 2005, they bought a 100-acre farm in East Devon, and I've designed all the buildings on that property over the last 15, 20 years. And about 5 years ago, I've been a shareholder of River Cottage for many years, and about 5 years ago, we were talking as the shareholders about how to restructure our business, and the two other partners in the business, so there's myself, Hugh, and Guy now, they basically decided together that I should take on the role of chief executive of a business that I've understood for 20 years, but having had no experience running a food business, it was quite a leap of faith at the end of the day. But actually, I'm completely, focused in my life on food and how one eats, where one sources one's food from. And part of that challenge comes from my relationship with Hugh. It's not somebody you can have as a friend if you're not capable of cooking for him, because ultimately, you might get into trouble. And he does get his hands dirty in everyone else's kitchen and starts meddling in what we eat. But for me, it was a really interesting challenge after 25 years as an architect, running an architecture practice and working all over Europe. So I rose to that challenge, decided it was a fantastic idea, and 4 years later, here I am running a business which we have about 75 employees. And, our mission is really to teach people where food comes from and how to get that food from where it originates onto their plate in a really sustainable, ethical, and positive way. So over the 30 years of me being engaged with River Cottage, I've learned so much about what we call the Food Continuum, which is a system where if you take originally the hunter-gatherer, which is what we are as a nation, what we were as a nation thousands of years ago, to the other end of the food continuum, which is effectively production, industrial production, and industrial food production. And at River Cottage, one of our missions is really to move the pendulum away from the industrial food production closer towards the traditions of the hunter-gatherer. And I think for us, that's something that's really crucial. And we came up with a strapline about 4 years ago when I took over the business called Food to Inspire Change. And the most important thing is when people eat, we don't want it just to be energy for people. We want them to see how it can change their lives, right from having your own garden, understanding the seasonality of food and how you can translate that into a better diet and a healthy lifestyle. So that's our crucial mission these days. And I think it relates so much to the built environment. And being an architect myself, I understand how spaces have changed, in cities especially, over the last 30 to 40 years. And you can notice that at King's Cross alone. If you look at this development now, and you think when it first started 12, 14 years ago, there's a huge urban space here, which is basically full of concrete, or in this case, granite. And if you start to go through the development up here, down Stable Street, you'll see that there's far more nature and trees involved and embedded in the scheme as it's developed over the years. And I think these things are really crucial. What we really need is growing space in urban environments. And I think that at River Cottage, that's what we try to encourage people. We don't just serve them fantastic food, we teach them about where it comes from. So, thanks.
Fantastic. So clearly quite a range of perspectives, but a real passion for food and growing and systems here. So I guess my first question is, how bad is it? If you think about it, by 2050, 60% of the world will be living in cities. In the UK, already 90% of us live in cities. When we live in cities, we inevitably become disconnected from nature in all sorts of ways. But how bad and how broken is our food system from your own perspective, whether that's kind of from, discussing about, the large organizations or within individual communities or from an architectural perspective? So how broken is it? How bad is the food system? What are the issues we're facing? Go ahead, Mark.
It's really buggered, actually. And looking at it from both of those sides, so from the larger organisations, that's about risk and supply chain, and we're seeing the fractures in that now. And let's not, we use the word supply chain, these are people. People are growing stuff for us, and we don't pay the full cost of food anywhere near at the moment. So the large organisations are worried on one hand about the stuff coming in. They're also confused by the consumer. These are words that are uncomfortable to say, or the citizen who's changing their habits and actually don't want to eat or drink what they get given anymore. You know, when 60% of food in America is hyper processed. 52% of food in the UK is hyper-processed. This food isn't good for us. This is as far from where we were as hunter-gatherers as we can get. In fact, I've just had my hair cut in Euston, an Albanian barber, young guy, and he was saying he might go back to Albania, but maybe not to live. But then again, the food's so fresh, and when he eats here, he just ends up feeling really ill. And that's, I didn't say to him what I was doing. I was just chatting about my hair. But when you look at the stats, you know, food accounts for 26% of greenhouse gas emissions. That is staggering. It's half of all habitable land is used to grow food. 70% of all freshwater withdrawals are used to grow food. And 78% of all global ocean and freshwater eutrophication is because of agricultural runoff.
Eutrophication.
Thank you.
What's that mean?
It is when you get, it's pollution. So it's when you get low oxygen waters going back into the sea. It creates dead spots and it kills the ocean. It's apart from climate change, which is the single biggest challenge to the oceans and to fish by miles. You've then got overfishing, which is next. Then the third biggest one is ocean debris, and within ocean debris, the biggest challenge is agricultural runoff. And that's what's killing the oceans. I mean, plastic's really bad. Clearly.
And in that agricultural runoff is what?
Pesticides, herbicides. It's also urine, feces, anything that comes off the farm. 16% of the chemical input that we place in the soil gets absorbed by the foods. The rest gets washed away. And because our soils are so broken, it's not held on to. And because we do crazy things like ploughing downhill, we're actually making this much, much worse. If we can rebuild the soils, we stand a chance of solving these problems.
So is that rebuilding of soil and the soil depletion? I mean, that is kind of absolutely, excuse the pun, at the root of it.
It's right under our noses, it's right under our feet, and we've got to do something about it. We've destroyed the soil's ability to not just hold carbon. You know, potentially the soils, if looked after properly, could take 40% of global carbon back out. It currently is balancing around about 24 to 26% of carbon output. The soils are doing that, and they're getting worse. And as the climate warms and as soils warm, they release carbon at a higher rate. So we're going to be in this ever decreasing challenge with soil. We have to protect the soil now. I think the UN said we were 60 years away from the collapse of soil structure. We had 60 harvests left, is the words they used. And we're now 5 years from that report. So I've got a granddaughter who is 2. So within her lifetime, there will be no food growing in the way that we can grow it now. So this is really terrifying, but...
Going to leave that but.
Okay.
Sarah, obviously your work is focusing a lot more on at grassroots level, at the communities. You know, how are the people you're working with, how are their food systems broken? You mentioned some of those suppliers that they are used to relying on. And of course, we're all seeing... those suppliers becoming, clearly much more fragile. It's not like you go to the shop and it's there. We're seeing empty shelves. And that's like, is that just because they haven't restocked it? You go back the next week and it's not there. So how bad is it? Not just the shelves, all those suppliers, but just in general, with your communities.
It's a real problem. It was the motivation for the group of people I work with to kind of get together and go, right, we've got to do something really fast, because we were really worried about the pandemic making the situation a lot worse. It was already bad, and it just kind of, under the lens of the pandemic, it was basically just real food poverty, basically, in East Brighton. But I think in lots of urban spaces, actually, there's a lot of unseen poverty that goes on. So there's organisations like the Chomp organisations in Brighton. There's Moulscombe Chomp that work with families during school holidays, because actually providing meals during holidays is really difficult. They're quite dependent on the meals that they get for free at school. So there's been quite a lot of press exposure about, and the Marcus Radcliffe work around food and around free meals, but basically, parents going without food in order to feed their children, substituting meals with things like crisps because they're cheap and you can get them at the shop. But so there was that kind of thing going on, but also the supply routes. Actually, there are no local greengrocers in our area. There are no places to get fresh fruit and veg that aren't supermarkets. There's like an over-reliance on the supermarkets and on the really, really cheap produce that is sort of supported by this very unsustainable system. So it's affecting the people that are struggling basically the worst. It's affecting people on lower incomes much more disproportionately, I would say. The sort of food supply issue is one, but the other is just the lack of kind of education around food and what you can do with simple fresh ingredients, because it isn't being taught in schools, and that's just been kind of talked about in the National Food Strategy. There's lots of adults just have kind of got so far removed from they're needing convenience food basically, because it's living to work kind of thing too. So having the time to grow your own food or having the time to prepare meals from fresh is something that's under pressure, especially if you're raising a family or you're juggling. So I think there's like real problems that aren't just about where the food comes from, but actually the time and the skills to be able to cook food that's good for you, and therefore people are leaning on things that aren't good for them, and are really limited in terms of choice. I think choice is a key thing, actually. I would say the other thing is about just access to the skills for growing foods. Like, a lot of people just don't know where to start, and that's something that we've been trying to help with. But there's loads of scope, especially on the urban fringes. There is land to do it. There are front gardens and things, but people just don't know how, and they don't have access to the resources.
So on that sort of idea of sort of urban design, Stuart, if you can just pass it over to Stuart. Tell us about the sort of changing nature of architecture and how it's sort of once facilitated the ability for us to grow our own food, and has now since changed. There's a sort of change in perception. Obviously, a lot of the work that you do at the River Cottage is, quite a utopian space for a lot of people. You see it on television. Oh, if only I had a bit of farmland. But we once did in our cities, and even the Dig for Victory, not so long ago, for many of our audience, will have been a thing that they actually re-engaged our cities. How has design and the shape of our cities affected this, and how bad is it in our cities now? I mean, because it's probably something that a lot of developers aren't really engaging with.
Yeah, I mean, I think the lack of urban environments to grow food is catastrophic. I mean, where do you grow food? And when have you recently been to a house in West London where, the garden was designed for production when it was built in the sort of late 1700s, early 1800s? If you go to most gardens now, they're decorative. There's no production in those gardens. So there's no food production really in the city. I mean, there's a whole process around how we need developers to start creating urban spaces. How many allotments can you find when you're walking around here? I mean, I have a friend who has an allotment on Hampstead Heath. There's a 7-year waiting list to get an allotment.
Do you know what the irony is almost right here, there used to be something called the Skip Garden, which was a community growing system, which was absolutely magical, that got slowly, smaller, and then it just sort of disappeared.
Which was run by one of my daughter's former teachers, Roddy. And it's so disappointing, that whole experience. But I think, so to give you a good example of that, so the Kresny Foundation in Detroit, so I took my architecture students there from UCL several years ago. And of course, the destruction of Detroit because of the failure of the car industry left a really urban wasteland. And actually what happened is that the Kresny Foundation started investing in food production gardens in Detroit. Now, it did come up with certain problems because there's a lot of lead in the soil. So there's a real problem in that growth and how you treat the soils. But actually, there was no food in the urban environment in Detroit. The city was bankrupt. The problems were really, exacerbated by what's called white flight. The middle-class Americans left the city. The whole urban environment became really depleted of resource. Streetlights don't work. But actually what really was successful was actually growing, giving people land to grow and supporting them with growing techniques, because people don't know how to grow things. That's one of the major issues. So I think that there are ways of changing cities, but you need legislation for that. I think you need the Mayor of London to be focused on legislating to create growing space, not just green space, which is decorative, but growing space. I mean, obviously carbon sequestration works when you start putting trees into spaces, but it doesn't provide any food resource. And then we're really all in the supermarket buying our food. And as you very rightly said, at the moment, there are lots of empty shelves. And I mean, I don't go to supermarkets, so that's one of our things, but that's my choice, at the end of the day. And there is a local greengrocer in the town where I live, so it's really positive. But I remember when March last year, 2020 came, I was approached by a woman called Tiggy Parry, who owns a food hub in East Devon. And she approached me and said, look, is there any way River Cottage can help? Because there's a rush on the supermarkets. There are queues, people can't get the right produce and everything. Is there any way you can help? Our business was closed because of the pandemic, but we kept a series of chefs in place. And what we started to do was give them meals every Friday, so 100 meals to the food hub, and then they distributed them to the rural area, not urban. We're talking rural areas, and food poverty is so hidden, so you don't see it in the same way as you do in an urban environment. You've got no idea there's food poverty in the rural environment. And so she was distributing food to all these people. And what she came to me after 6 months of us producing food, and she said, it's not the food we need to give them, it's the help we need to give them to grow the food, to cook the food, etc. So it's actually the education, not really the food, that's solving the problem. So she asked us if we'd partake in her food hub to start providing chefs every week to teach people, and if we'd bring groups to our farm, because we have a huge market garden and kitchen garden at River Cottage. So that's what we've now embarked on. We've embarked on this process where people come, and a few weeks ago I met this father with single parent with 3 children who are teenagers, and he came to the food hub, and our chefs were teaching him how to grow food. And the astounding thing is the distance that the children have from the actual produce. The carrot out the ground, you think it's not true. It is true. They don't know what it is. They don't know what to do with it. They don't know you can eat it as a raw item. The potato is, as you said, it's a crisp or a chip. It's not a potato. And what you do with it. And I think that simple education process, which has disappeared from the national school curriculum. I mean, you said your kids do have home economics at school. I know that that's rare in the national curriculum now, where it's absolutely paramount that we teach our children how to cook and how to engage with food to help them move along the continuum that I started out in the beginning.
My children are here, and I hope you're listening to that. Okay, we've got to teach how to cook. Okay. I
bet they can cook already.
So Sarah, obviously Stuart's got this fantastic resource. It's a globally well-known brand, but you're dealing with a very different situation. You're dealing with kind of groups of people who don't have that education. They do have resources, but I mean, where do you start to engage communities with this idea if you don't have a central hub to bring them around with an existing infrastructure or knowledge base? I mean, where do you start? How do you get people engaged with it?
So that's what we've been working on, is exactly that question. Where do you start? How do you reach people? And I think the key is to go very, very local. To not necessarily assume that people are going to turn up at community centres too, because actually some of the people that need most help actually might not have the confidence for that all the time or what have you. So we've been literally thinking about, okay, how can we get to their street? What can we do to engage people in their front gardens? Those kinds of things. So we've tried different things. So initially we were running a veg box project that we were getting people involved in, kind of producing the veg boxes, learning about where we were sourcing the food from, having those conversations. We've used lots and lots of different volunteers and kind of got them to feed into the project to help us reach the right people, because that's a challenge. There's lots of people that need support that won't necessarily go, hey, I really, really need support here. It's more about connecting communities because there's so much disconnect. What we started to do was two different strands. So the cooking side, we decided actually what we needed to do was like tasters and conversations. So rather than going, right, we're going to cook this today because it's going to be useful for you and you're going to be able to access these ingredients, let's actually go back a little bit and go, let's have a conversation about food. What have you got in your cupboard? Have you got potatoes and carrots? Like, what do you do with those if you need to make a meal? What about trying this, this, and this, and actually getting community chefs to have those conversations with people about what would actually be useful? So we've been getting people to talk about awkward vegetables. So when we were doing the veg box project, things like beetroot, people were like, oh, what do I do with that? And it looks different, and it's got all these roots attached, and can I eat those leaves? And all those kinds of questions came up. So just having conversations around food in community spaces was one of the things we started to do, getting people to taste things and share what they did know and work out where the gaps were. So that's what we're doing on one strand. The other is to actually link that with growing food. So we started to go, okay, well, not everyone's got a garden. What can you grow on your windowsill that's going to be useful? So we started with microgreens and we started with pea shoots, and that brought people joy. It was really, really nice to watch. We started setting up stalls at different local spaces. So at the community garden that I work at, and Morecambe Community Market, which is a social supermarket that was set up during the pandemic too. We just, after people had done their shopping, we'd then have a conversation and say, look, do you want to try this? We'll provide you the resources, give it a go, tell us how it went next week, and report back. And we set up a forum so people could ask questions. Worked out that actually everyone in the area is having an issue with slugs if they are trying to grow things. Work out what the problems are, work out what share the risk, I think was part of it. Give people confidence around, if I try and fail, it might not be down to me. It might be something that's to do with the soil in that area, or it might be, a tricky year for tomatoes because of blight, or,
But you're kind of bringing people together around nature and around that sense of growing.
Yes.
And that shared connection to strengthen communities. And when you strengthen communities and you have a kind of shared point of interest, you can share knowledge and skills, of which there will inevitably be some within those different age groups.
Yeah. I think it's linking in the community experts as well, because there's lots of people that have the knowledge that don't know where to share it, and then other people that would really like the knowledge that don't know where to find it.
Okay, so Mark, you're obviously involved with some really exciting organisations, but I know that you've been doing some great work with Green Lab. Tell me the role that innovation has in terms of shaping our future food production, and some of the kind of things that you've been doing at Green Lab, because we hear kind of fantastical stories about how we're all going to be eating grasshoppers and bugs and different sort of quite challenging food systems. I mean, how has Green Lab supported innovation in our food system?
So initially it went down that route. It went down, what are the alternatives to protein? Protein is a problematic source, particularly animal protein. 77% of all land use and only 18% of all calories. There's some really imbalances there. So looking at more palatable versions of insect eating, that's where they went. If I'm honest, that's probably not where we needed to go. That's probably not innovative enough. I think the innovation needs to happen at community level. So what Green Lab is doing now is embedding itself within local growing communities and working with people. As a really great project. A student of mine from Loughborough University, a guy called Will, who set up a company with his brother. Harry fell in love with a woman in Greece, and they bought 2 acres of land, 2 fields of land, and it's got 200 olive trees, and they now produce some of the best olive oil I've ever had. And the interesting thing is, they're doing it in a soil rebuilding way. That is, the innovation is actually to go back 50 years, not to go forward 50 years. And I think that's the mistake we made at Green Lab to start off with. So by going back 50 years, they've avoided all the problems with harvest collapse that happened last year. And they've now got this bizarre situation where they've got 60 and 70-year-old olive farmers on the same island coming to these 23, 24-year-old English boys and men and going, teach us what you know. And they're like, you already know it. You've just forgotten it. So I think backwards is the innovation, if I'm honest. And I think all roads, it's interesting that you talk about Detroit. So a really good friend of mine is Davita Davison. She runs a great project in Detroit and Sydney, where rather than create allotment and communal growing space, she's helping the black community grow food in their yard. And the way she got to community was through health. She went to the doctors and said, what are the problems? Type 2 diabetes and obesity. Right. Can you give them a prescription to come and talk to me? And then she set up these amazing community growing networks, and people are beginning to reverse type 2 diabetes, beginning to see health improvements through what they grow in their yard. And obviously there's a kind of community cement or a community mortar that is created by sharing those skills that they didn't have before. Those skills didn't exist before. They'd kind of been lost. So she's really worth looking out for. Davita Davison's in a TED talk and some clever stuff like that. So the innovation, to answer your question, the innovation is to go backwards as well as forward. Obviously, in certain places, we're going to need to go to higher density nutrient creation and vertical farming, and all of those things are really interesting.
What does higher density nutrients taste like?
Was it taste like?
Yeah.
It tastes all right.
Is it?
Yeah, it tastes all right. But you've got to remember, everything's changed. So if you grew a tomato 50 years ago, the quality and the nutrients that came out of that, to get the same nutrients and quality out of tomatoes now, you'd need to eat 10 of them. 10 to 1. That's because we've made it more palatable, a little sweeter. We've made these things. If you think about kale, kale is almost edible these days, right? Whereas back in the day, it was just brutally vicious. So we've kind of bred sweetness in, and we've bred nutrients out. So nutrient density would be saying how much growth can we get in one, 10 meter square patch, and we need to increase that because number one, we're growing in cities and we don't have the space. And number two, we need to feed 10 billion people. Although the population will fall towards the end of this century. Some really interesting trends there. And food deserts are really, so I used to work in Bradford, as I said earlier, and you saw huge food deserts on the edge of the city, big housing estates that were built with one small convenience store that didn't want the risk of stocking fresh fruit and vegetables because it might go off, right? So they stocked frozen and convenient food, have all the fibre stripped out, all that sort of stuff. I live in the countryside now in Leicestershire, and my local store stocks the same food. This is not just an urban problem. This is an education problem.
So you've mentioned a success story there about your friends with the olive groves and how they're starting to influence some of the other farmers around them. Could I just ask you, because these are quite depressing subjects sometimes, could we just have a success story? Tell us, a little mini win, an anecdote where you've just gone, do you know what, we've actually managed to make a difference in the way people perceive and engage with food and nature.
Well, I think at River Cottage, our success story was our engagement with the local food hub. The fact that we've literally been asked to be involved. I'm now a trustee of that food hub, and we invest in it. And what's fantastic is we have 13 chefs who work in the kitchens at the farm and on our property, and they are so excited about going. So the head chef is rotating all of our chefs every month through this food hub kitchen to teach people in the local area. And these are people who've never really touched River Cottage. As you say, it's a little bit utopia when you go there, and of course it's all about television and book writing, and there's a whole positivity, but actually that making change is actually what's really important, and at grassroots level. The other thing that it brings in is, to me, the biggest challenge is the sort of seasonality of food, or lack of it these days. You go into somewhere like Waitrose here, and I know we've talked about this, and so, I don't eat meat, but, there are certain things you need to find for protein, and of course the avocado is a classic modern example of something that's absolutely, heavy in that field, but it's very seasonal. You can't really grow them in the United Kingdom. They're shipped from all over the world. You can go to Waitrose and there's never a time where you can't get an avocado. Well, that's a problem in itself. There are millions of avocados being flown around the world from Peru or wherever they're coming constantly because of the yearning for the demand for that. But the yearning for demand comes from the supply chain in the first place. If we actually if we followed a seasonal diet, which, we still have seasons, okay, climate change ruining those seasons, but if we still have seasons, it wouldn't have that issue in it. And I was just in Norway in the Arctic Circle last week, and, everything there is seasonal. So there's in a very particular time of year, there's the season where the cod come to the North Norwegian islands, the archipelago called Lofoten on the west coast of Scandinavia, and the cod rush comes, and literally there are millions of cod, and all the fishermen go there and they fish the cod, and the seas are not depleted there at that time of the year. But that's the only time you get cod. We went out fishing in September. There's no cod to be found. But the weird thing is, some of the restaurants in Lofoten in Norway are selling cod, fresh cod, shipped over from Alaska on their menus in September, because cod is renowned, that area is renowned for cod. Where actually in the place we were working, everything was seasonal. So, there's a guy called Nick Strangeway, who's a very famous barman from London. He'd go out and he'd pick juniper and he'd put that in the cocktails he was making, and we'd find tiny little slightly sour blueberries on the hills, and they'd end up in the food. And I think those things are what makes you realize that actually you can still eat seasonally. I mean, there is the hunger gap in the United Kingdom, where in our garden we do struggle from sort of March to May time, March to late April, or late February to April, where there's not much in the ground apart from some brassicas. But the rest of the year you can follow a fairly seasonal diet, both in meat rearing of animals, in fishing. The fish aren't the same in the sea all the time. They migrate around. And it's the same with the avocado is the one that blows my mind. I mean, of course, we don't really use citrus fruit at River Cottage, but apart from ones we grow. But, it's just things like we don't have avocados in our business because of that major problem. They're incredibly water hungry, and they are flown from all over the world, and they seem to be in every supermarket every day. They're quite hard often, though, which is quite disappointing.
And they're controlled by gangs.
Oh, are they?
Yeah, there's a whole load of gang control. Sorry, it's like a drug cartel.
Yeah, it is like a drug cartel, and there are good avocado growers for certain, and there are avocado growers that ship them here rather than fly them here. Yeah. Shipping adds so little to the environmental impact. Flying is horrific, but it's really. Do you mind if I pick this up? Is that okay? I feel really bad. I'll pass straight to you. I promise you. But I'm on one. So I'm in terms of good stories. There's a few things coming. Like number one, you're here. You're all beautiful people sat here wanting to know more and better, and that wouldn't have happened 5 years ago. Guarantee that. Number two, there's a few companies that I'm working with.
Certainly not at a design show.
I know. Yeah, but this is design, right? Yeah. The way we design our lives is got food in it. I'm working with a lovely company. I won't name them because it's not an advert, and they make an alternative to hummus. So rather than shipping chickpeas in from wherever and olive oil in from mainland Europe, they're making hummus from fava beans grown in Yorkshire and rapeseed oil grown in, I think, Lincolnshire, and the garlic is grown in the UK as well. Now, that's amazing. I can't tell. I actually prefer it, right? So that's an incredible story. And you nudged me actually when you talked about the cocktail world. So I work a lot with bartenders. Bartenders are amazing. It's not a job you do just because you can't find a real job. You do it because you're really inquisitive. And bartenders are the most amazing kind of like gatherers and foragers, and they want cocktails that taste like now. If we're going to get back to seasonal, there's loads of lessons we can learn from bartenders, and you might not think that if you didn't drink a lot.
I think I could investigate this subject more.
Let's do it.
Yeah. And Sarah, just a quick wing, because we're kind of heading towards the end. So just tell us, like one inspirational story. It could just be about one family. It doesn't need to be like, big research led. Where have you kind of had a really good win, good feel good moment?
I just actually wanted to link onto the seasonal side of things and just say that, like connecting to the seasons can bring so much joy. Like I was talking about the joy of growing pea sprouts on your windowsill. I think that definitely has been a win, kind of connecting people and getting people talking about growing food and sharing those risks has been really powerful, actually. And just making it accessible, making people feel that they can have a go, and you don't have to be an expert straight away. I think that's really, really important. And things like the foraging, so just reminding people about the joy of seasonality, like going out picking blackberries. I wonder how many people here went out and picked blackberries this year. Those things exist for us to kind of rediscover. And, there's quite a lot of kind of literature out there to kind of encourage you to start foraging. But I think that, food does bring people together, doesn't it? Feasting together is something we've done for, thousands of years. And there's something inherent in that actually being so socially disconnected and our food system being really disconnected, I think there's some links there that actually food can help us with the social connection too.
Great.
So, yeah.
Okay, I've got time for two more questions. Technology obviously seems to be kind of at the bottom of this, the desire to create more food from ever smaller portions of land, higher yields. But surely, we've got this incredible technology, and I think when we see the issue of food and the future being picked up in the media, we're often kind of being pushed towards kind of vertical farming, hydroponics, aquaponics, that we can grow massive amounts of stuff underground and then it's just sort of in the middle of the cities. I mean, what role does technology play in saving the world with food? So, Mark, maybe you've got something to say about kind of hydroponics, vertical farming. I mean, is that a viable alternative?
I've got something to say about everything, actually, but I'll be very quick on this one. Hydroponics, vertical farming, there's clearly a role, right? Clearly you can increase the amount that you grow in a space, and that makes perfect sense from a financial return point of view.
Just explain what difference between hydroponics and what they are, just very briefly.
Yeah, so hydroponics are where you grow plants, or you grow plant systems with the roots dangling into water rather than in soil. And in the water you would have fish, and those fish would defecate in the water, and that becomes part of the feed, and therefore you're growing the fish and you're growing plants above them. It's a nice system, maybe not for the fish, but for everybody else it is. But technology is super interesting here, and I got a lovely brief a while back from a company who they manage the point when it's the right time to dispatch or kill an animal, because 52, I'm going to quote you another stat, 52% of all animals are sent to the slaughterhouse out of spec, which means they're either too big or too small. So they either get returned to be fattened up a bit more, that's another stressful journey, or they get killed and the supermarket or whoever doesn't pay the full price for them. So the farmer loses all the time. So this company, they regulate exactly, everything's done with blockchain technology and very small RFID tags. How much that animal's eaten, when it's ready to go, when it should go, and how it should go. And that reduces the challenge of paying for travel, but also dispatching at the wrong point. I gave them the best strap line ever, and they didn't use it. Making death palatable, but they didn't use that, which is a shame, I think. I don't know why. So that kind of technology is super, super interesting. But then also when we look at harvest technology, you can begin to use, and we can use drones for everything, right? But you can begin to use drones to know when it's exactly the right time to harvest something, so that our yield is exacerbated and enhanced and increased. And the key thing for me is how we use technology to understand soil structure and rebuilding carbon intensity, because it's not just being able to kind of like repatriate carbon, which is a good thing. For every 1% increase in organic matter in the soil, an acre of soil can hold another 100,000 litres of water. So we can deal with flooding and then the soil erosion that comes with that. So technology has a role, but maybe not in the way that the Asimov or the science fiction writers thought.
Sarah, obviously you're involved with communities, and it seems to be very hands-on in terms of growing things. I mean, does technology play a role in bringing people together or making this stuff more accessible?
I think. It's an interesting question. I was just thinking about renewable energy sources. Basically, I was thinking about solar powered. or electric cars and vehicles for transporting goods. Like we've been looking at, a milk float. Could we do a veg ban on a milk float, that kind of thing, or could on electric vehicles? Quite a few of the different food projects in Brighton have got electric bikes now for distributing. So we're sort of cutting food miles, and we're also cutting the carbon footprint. So I think those kinds of things in technology work, but also like we do use social media for connecting people, and I think that has helped our reach. So there are clever apps that help with food waste and things too. So I think it's a case of how people are using the technology. I think there's always ways to make things more efficient, but it's keeping the earth in mind. And I think we touched on permaculture a little bit, but I think permaculture kind of comes into it in terms of thinking about using design systems to balance people needs, the needs of the planet in terms of our environmental needs, and kind of acknowledging that we've got limited resources, so it's not just more and more with no consequence. Actually, a fair share amongst resources is key. So technology used with those things in mind, I think, is got to be helpful.
And Stuart, do you have something to contribute? Maybe in terms of the sort of, maybe it's about River Cottage and the sort of media presence, or is it about the way we can identify spaces in cities through technology to engage with food systems?
Yeah, I think for me, technology is really challenging in the food industry, because what it seems to have done is just, as you mentioned, Mark, about hydroponics, it's a way to grow things much, much faster. They have less taste, there's less sort of quality in the food, but actually it provides a bigger harvest, a greater crop, and also it avoids things like blight and seasonal restrictions. So if you go to Dutch farming systems for tomatoes, there are literally millions of tomatoes grown in hydroponics, and they're always available 24/7, 365 days a year. For me, technologies, I think it's about thinking about where the system benefits. So for example, we at River Cottage only import two things from around the world, which is coffee and olive oil. We do use rapeseed oil, but we still use olive oil. But our olive oil is imported into the country by a company called Ship by Sail, who are based in Bristol. And these guys have a sailboat, and they trek off to Portugal. They collect all the olive oil, they bring it back to Bristol, and they drive it to our farm in an electric vehicle, and it's a net zero transport system. Now, of course, it's very much a niche solution, that. But we're talking to them at the moment about how we can grow the stuff, we can grow the number of products that they can bring to us, and can they actually go and do this in many more places. I think that use of technology is great. So all the product manufacturers we're working with at the moment, like our kombucha maker and our beer maker and our kraut and kimchi makers, we've set a line now in the sand which says they all need to be net zero transport systems, because for us that's really crucial. But it's a challenge for them, because lots of times they use delivery mechanisms that are anything but net zero. They're basically diesel. They might grow organic food, they might move it from A to B, but actually they employ a third-party courier to carry it, and they don't engage with that third-party
And often
courier.
it's not just the diesel engine, it's the refrigeration unit.
Oh my God, it's the
not
refrigeration unit that's not monitored, the diesel pollution,
there's a lot more to
all
that,
of
isn't
it. There's so many layers to this thing. And then I think going to renewables, I mean, we have an off-grid water supply. We have a biomass system on our farm. We are spread with lots of renewable energy, but electricity is the biggest challenge. We don't have a wind. We do have a turbine. We don't have a wind farm, so to speak. We don't have enough solar power, and even if we did, we wouldn't get enough of the right weather at the right time of the year to fund this. So actually, what we're doing is buying green energy, so to speak, from a green energy provider. I think there's got to be better ways, and one of the ways is that I'm talking to our team about is reducing the energy consumption. So for instance, we're off an artesian well, and my chefs, I'm going to admit this, they'll leave the tap running all the time to wash the salad, because that's the way they think. And you have to change the people's perception of how you do that. Electricity is the classic thing. People don't engage with reducing their electricity consumption. So I think technology in that world is where we need to focus, because if we consume less, if we're as consumers, if we take less water, take less electricity, take less sort of heating product, then we end up in a far better place. So architecturally, for instance, design-wise, if you make buildings like passive house buildings, which are, they need very little energy into them in the first place, that's where your solution lies, I think, in the world of design. And surely the food industry can be exactly the same.
Thank you. Okay, so we're coming to the end of our talk, unfortunately. I know that we could keep going on this because it's just so in-depth, and there's obviously a lot that we haven't managed to cover. But I'd just like to sort of round up the conversation with asking our panel to come up with some ideas. I mean, obviously, we've got a fantastic audience here, and also the one that will be watching as we've recorded this, of architects, designers, landscape designers, kind of citizens of the world. And I'd just like to ask you, as a closing kind of idea, what would you say to our audience, one thing they could do to engage them with these ideas of how can food save the world?
I think from my perspective, it's about getting our children to cook. If children can cook, and if that's what they learn when they're very young and it becomes inherent in their existence, I think we'll have a very different world in 50 years' time if all the kids in the world are always cooking. And if they enjoy it, you need to make it enjoyable. So for me, how do we get the education system to move in that direction? Because lots of children don't cook, and that's a sort of sacrilege, I think, in my sense.
Sarah?
I'm torn, but I was going to say connect with your neighbours around food growing, so encourage each other. So if somebody next door is growing tomatoes and you see, have that conversation and have a go on your own windowsill if you can. You can start really small, and I think you can get a lot of joy from that. And if you can help to connect up people on your street, then that, it starts to have ripples. But basically, don't think you're too small to make a change. I think that if you start really local with the things that you can influence, that's a good way to go.
And Mark?
Yeah, great. I'm torn too, so I'm going to do both. Firstly, we're at that time of year, all the sunflowers are coming into death. They're all beginning to fade. Take the seeds out, grow some microgreens, exactly that on your windowsill. Microgreens, sunflowers are beautiful. And then for you lot out there, for the architects and the clever folk who do stuff with buildings, think about how you can build natural systems in. So in the past, I've had great success using Australia's Phragmites reeds as a way of dealing with pollution, effluent, but we've also been using it to pump air circulation systems, HVAC systems, back into the building, and you can build the soil microbiology to remove viral load. So you can begin to add huge human benefit and grow, you can't eat them, but to grow amazing plants that do good stuff and to connect back to dirty fingers again. It's magic.
Get your hands stuck in.
Always.
Lovely. Well, we've run out of time, unfortunately, but, it's been a fantastic conversation, and clearly there are a lot of complex issues, but there are answers as well. We can make a difference, and whether that's through kind of engaging with the media, engaging with community, the role that technology has to play, we can literally fix the world with the food that we grow, eat, consume, if we think about it in a more circular, holistic way. So I would like to thank our fantastic panel, Mark Shayla, Sarah Fernan, Stuart Dodd. So if we could just have a round of applause for them and their insights. Thank you very much. And also just to say to you, take these ideas on board. There's so much going on here today. We have got the natural living tent up there. We've got the botanical market where you can buy plants. We've got the green grads. Go and see them. Some amazing new designs coming out. And we're going to be taking this conversation just over there to the Sleeping in Nature exhibition. Going to be having some botanical drinks. So do come and join us and ask our panel some questions. My name's Oliver Heath, and on behalf of Planted, we'd like to connect people, spaces and nature. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you.